O professor Mark Thornton visitou o Brasil para participar do primeiro seminário de Escola Austríaca de Economia, em Porto Alegre. Antes, ele passou por São Paulo e, sendo um especialista em economia informal, concedeu uma entrevista na rua 25 de Março, famosa por esse tipo de comércio. Ele também falou sobre Bastiat, as proibições e suas consequências e os ciclos econômicos.
We are here in São Paulo at 25 de Março Street with Professor Mark Thornton. Welcome, Mark, to Brazil. Good to have you with us at our conference in Porto Alegre. Good to have you here today.
Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful to be here and to see São Paulo and Brazil. It's so exciting, and I'm looking forward to the conference. It's amazing.
Let's have a walk a little bit on the street.
Okay.
I would like to ask you a few questions. You were the editor of the Bastiat collection, right?
That's correct.
Could you tell us a little bit about that collection and the importance of Bastiat in general?
Well, Bastiat was a Frenchman in the 19th century who saw growing government and socialism all around him, and the basic threat that it was to society. I mean, the fabric of society. And so he became involved in politics. He started writing economics. He started writing about how irrational government policy is and how socialism can really undermine the economy and undermine society. And so he wrote so eloquently for the common man, good common sense economics. And what we did was we collected all of his essays that were translated into English and put them all into one great collection. And it's a collection that on page one of that book, you just read one page of the 2-volume set and you know what it is to become an economist. So it's not hard. And after you read that first page, what you're going to do is you're going to see, hey, this guy writes like he's writing to regular people. And so you're going to be encouraged to read into the rest of the book. And so he was the man who, wrote out the free market economic tradition for everyone to understand. And so I would encourage everyone to get it. It's on the internet, and read that first page and see where you go from there.
Bastiat was not only an economist, but he was also an activist and politician. Do you think that today there's a role for economists to be doing similar things as Bastiat did in the 19th century?
Oh, absolutely. He was actually in the legislature of France. And so he was actively involved inside of government. He was also involved in free trade movements around the world. And after Bastiat died in 1850, his tradition of free trade continued on, and trade barriers around the world diminished, and we went through one of the best periods of economic growth the world has ever had in the second half of the 19th century. So, he saw the problems. He fought against those problems of government intervention and protectionism on an intimate, personal basis, and brought them to the common man. He got involved in politics. He got involved in other organizations, and it was all a very great success. So it's very much a possible thing to improve the world that we live in with just good common sense economics.
Let's talk a little bit about your book, Economics of Prohibition. What would you say are the underlying themes or theme of the different sorts of prohibition, of alcohol, of drugs, of smoking in public spaces or things like that? What would you say there's in common with these policies?
Well, it really doesn't matter what the good is that you're prohibiting. But the common result is when government comes in and tries to tell us what to do and how to do it, what not to do, what they end up doing is making the problem worse. And so with the problems of drug abuse get worse, the problems of alcoholism get worse. Every time government steps in and tries to be our nanny and our protector and telling us that we're not supposed to engage in certain voluntary interactions, what they do is they create a black market economy. They drive things underground. They take things out of the social realm where we have social norms that work against the secondary negative consequences, and they actually end up making everything worse. They create more crime. They create more political corruption. They fill up our prisons with criminals who shouldn't be there. And so it's a negative, a triple negative for society when government tries to interfere with voluntary interactions between people in terms of things like selling alcohol or smoking cigarettes and things like that. The private sector actually can do that on its own. If a restaurant doesn't want smoking in the restaurant or in a certain section of the restaurant, they can prohibit it. They can effectively prohibit it. But when government tries to do that on a nationwide scale, they just end up creating a large mess and they diminish the standard of living in society.
In Brazil, we have a big violence problem, especially in the big cities. And also in Rio, we have this to a different level, to a worse level, because most of the favelas, where the drug dealers hide, are in the middle of town. So I would ask you, what do you think would happen if we decided to stop the drug war and legalize not only the consumption of substances in general, but also the commercialization of those substances?
Well, first of all, you make the products much safer. You reduce the violence. You reduce the crime. In the United States, we have street gangs that are involved all in this, and they're involved in all sorts of crime. So the violence of the inner city is almost a 100% correlation with illegal drugs and other things that are illegal that these violent criminal gangs use to finance themselves. And it's criminal gangs in the city. It's groups that want to overthrow countries. Mexico, the problem on the border is so bad that thousands of people are being killed. So it's a worldwide phenomenon, and I blame my own country for most of the problem. But the world has got to rise up against all this insanity and put a stop to it, because it's creating all this crime. It's filling our courts and our prisons with people who probably shouldn't be there, and so the system can't control the regular crime of robbery, of murder, of rape. And so we've got to get the whole security system off of this insane war on drugs and put it back where it belongs. And all of a sudden, society becomes much more safe, it becomes much more normalized, and our standard of living rises just because we feel safer. So it's again, this prohibition is an insane policy. It leads to all the wrong results, and it corrupts our political process as well. So everything that I've found that has to do with prohibition is a negative, and there's no single positive, because these drugs are still available. They're available to kids, and when you commercialize these things, commercial dealers will not sell to minors. It's a common law around the world that, businesses don't sell dangerous products to young children. And so it does everything that we really want it to do in terms of making people better off, cleaning up the political system, improving the police and security system, the court system. It makes the products safer to consume because they're produced commercially rather than illicitly. And, thousands of people die each year from consuming illicitly produced heroin, illicitly produced cocaine, illicitly produced methamphetamines. If those things were produced commercially and sold at a pharmacy, the chances of people dying from that are hardly none at all. So it really is an insanity that the world is bought into, and fortunately, I think people's minds are changing around the world because the problems have really gotten that bad.
Nesta segunda parte da entrevista, o professor Thornton fala sobre as restrições de circulação de pessoas e produtos e de como os governos legitimavam a escravidão de índios e negros antigamente e como legitimam a escravidão parcial dos dias de hoje.
We here, Mark, in Brazil, in the 80s, we had a law that prohibited the production, the importation of any electronics products, especially computers, and it was in effect for maybe 10 or more years. Now it's not prohibited anymore, but we have huge tariffs, and of course we have contraband because of the prices in Brazil being so much higher than any imported price. How do you see the contraband with respect to the laws and the role that contraband plays? How do you see the whole?
Well, I mean, you take a step back. I mean, just the whole idea of limiting the ability of Brazilians to use computers through protective tariffs is insane. I mean, if you want economic progress and if you want more education and you want better business development, then you want the lowest price computers possible. You want the greatest number of computers possible in the hands of everyday citizens so that it increases your productivity. Even somebody who was trying to maximize government revenue should have recognized that. They must have been incredibly short-sighted or paid off or something, because computers are obviously just about to anybody that I've ever come across so vital to improving productivity and improving income and improving your standard of living and of integrating yourself into the global economy, which again cycles through higher incomes, higher standards of living, and even higher tax rates. I mean, higher tax revenues. So that whole idea is just baffling to me. And of course, if you put those restrictions on, then you are going to get this people smuggling things in order to avoid the taxes and in order to avoid the prohibitions. That's going to happen. They can't stop it. And they're wasting a lot of time. They're wasting a lot of effort of both the bureaucracy and the people. They're just throwing those resources down the drain, essentially. So it's crazy economic policy on all accounts, and I can't see really any justification for that at all, even from the perspective of a government bureaucracy that wanted more tax revenues. Doing what they're doing is counterproductive towards that goal even. So education, economic development is stymied when you prohibit or limit or tax. And you also make it a very unfriendly environment in terms of crossing the border. What would life be if it was the case where we didn't have to have passports and visas to get into countries, and we didn't have to pay customs, and we didn't have to go through all this red tape, but that we could just get on a plane and visit our friends in Brazil? Our people from Brazil could visit our friends in the United States and work through business ideas and work through developing friendships and relationships and the business opportunities that might come of that. The more we know one another, the more we share each other's problems and share each other's successes, the better off we all can be. And so the more Americans can visit Brazil and see what a fun place this is, and the more Brazilians can visit America, they can see different ways of doing things. We're both going to benefit from all of that. And so why put all these roadblocks in people's way? There was a time when you didn't need passports and visas and all this regulatory red tape and customs duties and filling out of forms and all that kind of stuff. There was a time in the world when you didn't have to do that, and it worked just fine. We developed the Western Hemisphere, okay? So, I mean, why slow that process down? Why keep our peoples apart? We live in a global world, and by gosh, there's no better way of all of us benefiting by breaking down all of those barriers as much as possible.
You're going to be speaking at our conference, which is the first Austrian economics conference in Brazil. You're going to be talking about the Austrian business cycle theory, and it's how is it in the perspective of the history of economic thought. How do you see the current crisis in the context of the history of economic thought, especially since we have a great success also of the rap, of the Hayek-Keynes rap, and because the Chicago school is now not in a good position after the crisis, because they always advocated for centralized money. How do you see the...
Well, first of all, I'm very excited to be here and to be participating in the conference. I think this is big time in terms of intellectual history, and so I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here today. But the main point that the Austrian theory of the business cycle makes is that it's the central bank's fault for causing inflation or higher prices in the economy, and it's the central bank's fault for mismanaging interest rates in terms of producing the boom and the bust, the recession and the boom phase of the cycle. and why all resources can get misallocated into the wrong investments. And so the Austrian theory, which has been downplayed by all the government economists for so long, has finally gotten a hearing through the rap video and through other means, and is starting to be accepted by the general population. It's the Federal Reserve, the central bank, is the problem, and that we need a more market-based money which doesn't have any government control over, which can't be inflated away. You know, our money the value of our money possibly could disappear overnight, and we've seen, you know, other countries where that's happened. You know, in Argentina, in Brazil, and in other places where they can evaporate huge percentages of the money. So the Austrian theory of the business cycle is what explains how the central bank's policies cause inflation and cause this business cycle. And the Austrian theory has helped Austrian economists to be able to predict these major crises. So that, you know, for example, the Austrians were talking about the housing bubble in the United States in 2003. Everybody else was ignoring it or disclaiming it. You know, our central bankers were saying that everything is fine. Even in 2007, all their testimony that I looked at said, you know, everything is great. And even these credit default swaps are making everything liquid and transparent, and they've really helped, you know, improve the market for these loans. Well, 6 months after their testimony, the economy goes into a crisis. They hadn't, well, if they saw it, they didn't tell us about it. But the Austrians were telling, at least the listeners to Mises.org and LouRockwell.com, that the central bank had engineered a bubble in the housing market, and this inevitably has to come undone. It inevitably has to crash. And so that's what the whole theory is about, and Austrians have been able to predict the major crises in the economy over the last 100 years.
Let me ask you about the economics of slavery. I know you're a specialist on the economics of slavery. Tell us a little bit about the cycle of the economics. Like, how did it start? Why did it become economically feasible to have slavery? How did it end as well? And also in the context of today we are not slaves, but since we pay 50% of our income in taxes, we're half slaves, let's say. How do you see that?
Well, slavery got started with public-private partnerships, where the government aligned itself with companies who went to Africa and got all these slaves and brought them to the New World. So it was the power of government backing up the private interest in profit, which is the most dangerous form of social organization, when you have the profit incentive and you have the power of the gun, the power of the warship. And so slavery was started in that way. It was very profitable initially, but inherently slavery is an unprofitable institution. It has to be propped up by government subsidies and government regulations and government restrictions in order to keep it profitable. And so in most of the Western Hemisphere, slavery ended peacefully. It was resolved in some cases gradually because it just didn't make any sense. And people saw it as an evil thing, that you shouldn't own other people. You know, and that's a fundamental axiom of Christianity and of all other religions and of most legal institutions. It was just this period of incredible slavery that eventually people realized was not working out economically, was morally reprehensible. And so politicians, as slow and as corrupt and as inept as they are, eventually they figured out a way to, in most cases, solve it. Again, my own country, the United States, is the worst example of this. I mean, in terms of the number of slaves imported and the fact that we had to go through a civil war in which slavery was done away with, and hundreds of thousands of people had to be killed in order to get it done. So I wish that the United States had followed the lead of the South American countries and the Caribbean and so forth, that were able to unwind it in a peaceful manner that was a complete success in almost every respect.
And what's the parallel between slavery and the situation we have today, that in which, in effect, we are part slaves or serfs, let's say?
Well, I mean, it's a veil. Today we live under a veil that where we don't think of ourselves as slaves. We're independent. We can walk around. We're not chained down. But the plantation still gets its cut. It's still taking 30 to 40% of our production and using it for their income. So, you know, in the slave days, the plantation owner, the slave owner would work the slaves and feed them just enough to get by, but would capture huge unearned profits. And in today's system, we don't think of ourselves as slaves, but we produce independently, and the government comes in and takes 30, 40, 50% of what we produce. So we are slaves, and we just don't know it. We're slaves, we're tax slaves to the state, and there's no justification that the state gives for taking our money, for stealing our money. Now they give some of it back to us, and they provide some services, and they try to get us involved with it, and they let us vote, and you know, all these ways to create the veil. But it's a veil of something that is almost as reprehensible as slavery itself.
You said that we are slaves, but we just don't know it. The Indians were hard to become slaves. Do you think this sort of rejection of some other person telling them what to do had part to do with that, because they had a different behavior as the black people, for example, at slavery time?
In terms of Brazil?
In terms of U.S.
United States? Yes. They rejected the idea of being willing to accept slavery for a long time. So they interacted peacefully with the white man. Initially, they traded and they gave him land, and they moved away from the white people, and they kept moving and moving and moving until it became apparent that it wasn't going to stop. And then the fighting started, and they lost those battles, and ultimately they ended up settling for a system of, you know, a sort of a plantation system where they were given plots of land that were of little or no value to the white man. And so they fought it voluntarily by moving away. Then they fought it violently by trying to oppose the white man. And ultimately, they, through sheer use of force, were essentially put onto the reservation. So it was a different approach because the Indian civilization had long traditions, cultural roots, and well-developed societies and systems of belief, whereas the slaves were ripped piecemeal from various different tribes, brought over in non-homogeneous groups. And so there was no alternative for them, whereas the Indians could just move, and they had a system of society to move. The Africans were ripped, you know, from various tribes at various times with various languages and cultures and traditions. And so in the early goings, they lacked the cohesion to oppose the system in the same way that the Indians did.
This year at the Forum da Liberdade, a big event in Brazil, the theme of the forum would be Mises and his book, The Six Lessons, as we call in Brazil, the economic policy book. What's your impression of Mises?
Well, I work for the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and I edited a book of quotations by Mises called The Quotable Mises. And I had been reading Mises for on and off for various reasons for about 20 years. And then about 5 years ago, they asked me to do this project. And so I sat down with everything that Mises had ever written and just read through them with a highlighter, taking quotes. Well, if we used all of those quotes, the book would have been about that thick. So it was just an unbelievable, fascinating experience to read day after day all of his works. He is the man that has essentially kept liberalism alive because socialism had just about killed it off. And Mises was the man who kept it alive theoretically and in the academia, and at the Institute we've been able to, or our institutes, we've been able to not only keep that alive, but I think we're on the verge of seeing a massive explosion of interest in the ideas of liberalism and libertarianism that are going to infect the entire world and change the way we live in a very dramatic way.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Absolutely my pleasure.